So, to all of you listening in this afternoon, thank you for joining us. Our session today will be on the One House, Many Nations, Policy, Practice, and Practicalities, and our presenter will be Alex Wilson. So Alex of Opaskwayak Cree Nation is a professor at the Department of Education Foundations and the academic director of Aboriginal Education Research Center at the University of Saskatchewan. Her teaching and research focuses on Indigenous land-based education, queering education, land protection through sustainable housing. The One House, Many Nations initiative works to address the dire housing situation in Indigenous communities, bringing much needed attention to the housing crisis in Canada. Most recently, One House, Many Nations Making the Shift research has been working with the youth of 4 First Nations to build 4 homes with homeless individuals in the communities. Dr. Wilson is collaborating with the Minobima Partnership to fund tree students and home builders for architecture students. I'm now going to pass it over to you, Alex. I'll get you to share your screen with us. You have a couple minutes till the top of the hour. And thank you again.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, and thank you to the University of Manitoba for the opportunity to present about some of the projects that we're working on. And some of the focus will be policy, practice, and as the title says, the practicalities of all of that. And as many of you know, housing is a huge issue within First Nations and Indigenous communities, not just across Canada, but we're finding that it's also impacting Indigenous people all over the planet. And of course, because of our unique climate here, there are additional challenges. Of course, though, Indigenous knowledge systems have existed in relation to our lands for thousands, tens of thousands of years. And so that is kind of the starting point for this presentation, is to start by acknowledging and validating that we have had an intimate connection to the lands that we come from since time immemorial. And that means since a time before we can even remember, or time before we even have stories for. So Indigenous peoples in North America, and particularly in the northern part of it, in our region here, we have lived on our land continuously for tens of thousands of years. So longer than most people on the planet have lived in connection to their homelands. Although we know that we have migrated, of course, due to 2 ice ages at least that we have in our oral history, and then migrated back when the ice receded. So with all of that connection comes the knowledge systems that have helped to sustain us all that time. These knowledge systems were encoded or entrenched or accessible through the languages that emerged from the lands that we live in relation with. And some people call that relationship, or that kind of relationality, natural law. And it allowed us to not just live, but also to thrive in the area. So if you look at the aerial photo on the right, that's a photo of the Saskatchewan River Delta. So I'm here coming from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, which is in Treaty 5 territory. We're on the Saskatchewan River Delta system. Saskatchewan River system is one of the largest freshwater deltas on the planet, and it rivals the Amazon River Basin in magnitude. The Saskatchewan Delta River on the surface of the land is also linked to a parallel river system that is below the land, below the surface. So there's actually 2 river systems, the one on the surface and the one below. And we have many stories of creatures and beings that can go from between the 2 worlds. So if you're thinking about just looking at this photo, what are some of the ways that you and your family, if you had lived on this, or if you live on this waterway, what are some of the ways that you would document and share knowledge? So, for example, where are the good fishing spots, or where's the dangerous place in the river? Where are the medicines? Where are certain plants that you would need, or other animals migrate for hunting and things like that? So all of the things that would sustain a healthy community, all of that is contained in a number of ways that we shared information about how to live with this land, and passed it on to our families and friends, and then also to the next generation. And so this is a real question for you to think about, like, what are some of the ways that you would document and share that information? Many people will probably say through stories or through songs. And of course, without iPhones and even a pen and paper, your imagination may be stretched a bit, but there are literally hundreds of ways that Indigenous people did record and share knowledge and pass it on to the next generation. And that knowledge was highly contextual, meaning that it changed, and it was acknowledged that it could change, or it was fluid, and it was very contextual to the time of year or the climate and a number of different factors. So to give an example of that, here is could be in the middle of December, could be in the middle of January, of course, when it's a full whiteout. Now, how does your understanding of where to go, where to find food, all of that, how does that change, and how do you pass on that knowledge? So we literally had many, many ways to map the territories without writing down, or without depending on GPS. And those were the policies, the unwritten policies and practices that allowed us to survive and thrive for tens of thousands of years in relation to the land. And all of that, of course, changed very quickly, within a blink of the eye, really, in terms of time, with the imposition of colonization, the fur trade, Canadian law, policies and practices that regulated and remapped our traditional territories. And along with that, a parallel process that remapped and regulated our bodies as Indigenous people, and then also our knowledge systems. On the upper left here is a drawing of the Saskatchewan River Delta, so it just shows the kind of scope of how big it is, starting in the Rockies and going all the way to the Cedar Lake. So all of these waterways connected to some major cities: Edmonton, Calgary, Saskatoon, Prince Albert, and then all working their way east and then draining up into the Hudson Bay. As you go further east along the river system, there's more First Nations communities, and this little arrow here shows where I am at the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. The system connects to Lake Winnipeg. Lake Winnipeg, the 10th largest freshwater lake in the world, the #1 endangered right now, as many of you know, mostly from phosphates that drain into the system from mega farms, the fertilizers that are used in those farms. Also impacting this waterway as our major farms and the phosphates from those. Oil spills, some of you may recall the Husky oil spill a few years ago. And then, just like every city, all of those cities have drains from their streets that go right into the river without filtration. And into the 1950s, up until then, even hospitals just pumped their effluent right into the river without any kind of filtration. So as you go downriver, the contaminants become more concentrated, And you can see that the people that kind of bear the brunt of all this pollution over decades are mostly Indigenous peoples that live along the waterways and rely on this water system for their livelihoods, for recreation, for spiritual practices, and for food. Another thing that has impacted this system is damming. So the Manitoba Hydro Dam at Grand Rapids, and then in our territory, the E.B. Campbell Dam in Nipawin. That has forever changed the landscape and regulates the amount of water that comes and goes from the territory. So that, of course, has impacted the animals, the plants, and then our access to food and livelihood as well. Another policy or another organization that has impacted, of course, the residential school era, and then a corporation that has been linked to the increased privatization of land, and in particular water, has been Ducks Unlimited. And so they've got a series of micro dams throughout the Saskatchewan River Delta, over 1,000 micro dams, I believe. It's hard to get a count, but we know that there are many, and we know that especially in the Summerberry and the marsh that is downriver from Opaskwayak Cree Nation, that Ducks Unlimited has irreversibly changed the landscape. And it hasn't increased habitat for ducks. In fact, the ducks are actually, numbers are decreasing, as are numbers of other kinds of birds, waterfowl, and moose, beaver, and other animals that live in that ecosystem. So I'm pointing this out because I think all of us know that colonization is a problem. As some people in design, especially in architecture, use the term the wicked problem. A wicked problem is a problem that as soon as you start to find solutions for it, it creates new bigger problems or other problems. And so that's exactly what colonization has done. And many people don't realize that the impacts continue today, and they're still being created. So, you know, what some people think is policy to, like, for example, partnership between the province of Manitoba and Ducks Unlimited, some people may see that as beneficial, when in reality, it's just another creating more problems for, in terms of Indigenous sovereignty, treaty rights, but also just in terms of the sheer damage to the landscape. So these are new ways of mapping our territory that are really in contrast to the way that we just started this discussion by validating knowledge that works with the land and is informed by the land. Up on the right here is the range road grid map. It's a little fuzzy there, sorry about that, but for every square, and many of you, you know, if you've flown over the prairies in the summer or even the spring and fall, you can see these lands gridded off like that, because there's often gravel roads or highways that kind of mark off those grids. For each tiny square, there's a monetary value attached. So this is the real estate map. And so this is a kind of a shifting from policy like natural law that recognized the value of land and water as life-giving, to a policy and practice that now prioritizes a commodification of land and water and attaches a monetary value to it. So how many kilowatts of electricity can a hydro dam produce? That's the value of water. How much is a plot of land worth, depending on what's below the land or what's in the land? And then if you look at this map on the lower left here, this is the Canadian well grid map. according to the poster, it's elegant, logical, and easy to understand. And what it does is it just shows you where all the potential wells are, or where the existing wells are for oil, natural gas, and then of course it attaches a monetary value. So we've seen a drastic shift in ideology that has accompanied the process of colonization that has impacted land and animals and all life, and including the lives of Indigenous peoples. And within that, also kind of an asymmetrical power distribution of who is impacted, and generally it has been felt by Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people most dramatically and most drastically. And as many of you know, the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people has been on the forefront of our thinking and actions because it is such a huge problem in the society. So all of this is linked to like a remapping of our knowledge and land. And you know, your colleague at the U of M, Adele Perry, has done a wonderful and important job, you know, discussing this in her scholarship. And I appreciate her work and always want to mention it. So this is a photo of old growth boreal that was just east of just west of Opaskwayak a couple of years ago. You can already see that there's something odd about this photo. That was taken in February because there's no snow there. So, you know, the impacts of climate change are quite observable, especially in the north, in the boreal forest region. Old growth boreal, meaning that these areas of forest have never been logged before. The fibers are long and strong, so they're highly desirable for certain products. They are chipped into wood chips here in the paw and made into SPK, or special craft paper. And because of the strength, the tensile strength and density of the old growth, they're particularly desirable for pet food bags and for bags that hold cement mixture. So the irony in colonial economics is that here in northern Manitoba, where we have an abundance of trees, it is against the law to cut down a tree and build a house out of it. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this broadcast, is that the housing crisis is so severe in Indigenous communities. And why is that? You know, why is it that we can no longer just harvest trees from our own territory and build houses out of them? And so that again is a kind of a symptom of this wicked problem of colonialism, that it keeps creating new problems. One of the ways, of course, that can be addressed or dealt with is by First Nations creating their own housing codes and their own regulations. And certainly many First Nations are doing that, as well as grassroots organizations. So through this kind of clear cutting of the boreal, our kinship systems, which were linked to natural law, have been disrupted, but not just disruptive, they've also been reorganized. And then the transmission of intergenerational knowledge has been interrupted and severed in many cases, again, linking to the residential school process, the child and family welfare system, the transfer of land from First Nations to the province, or the province transferring Crown land to private corporations. All of those are linked to housing policy as well. So the implications of that, of course, are that you have statistics like here in Opaskwayak, where we have a shortage of over 800 homes. We're needing 800 homes, meaning that not just 800 people need homes, but potentially 800 families. And we could build we could churn out a whole bunch of houses, but we'd still have the same problem. That is, the housing issue is not a building problem, really. It's a systemic, institutionalized problem of racism, which also connects to the exploitation of land, i.e., environmental racism. And then linked to that always is how that is gendered. So there's sexism, misogyny connected to that, and how homophobia, transphobia, class, how all of those things interconnect and support the empire, really. So one of the things that has happened that we can, document and try to undo is that we've shifted from a highly contextual, land-based way of being to a definitive system that's entrenched and enforced through Canadian law, policies, and then everyday practices. So there's inherent bias built into these policies, as I've mentioned, and I just wanted to give a couple of examples. The first from my own family. So this is the Muskrat Quota card. So most of our families in OCN have had or still have family trap lines. And those trap lines are, the way that we kind of traveled around seasonally from one area to another, mostly to gather and harvest, hunt food, but also during the trapping fur trade to harvest fur as part of our livelihood. This was my grandfather's card, Charlie Wilson. So there's a couple things. One, already you can see his anglicized name is on the card. Two is that my grandmother is not included on here, even though she was like obviously an integral part of the family. So you can see that this process is already like silencing or marginalizing or causing women to disappear. For every year, they have attached a quota of how many muskrat you're allowed to harvest. And again, they've remapped using now names. So Summerberry, so Reader actually was one of the Indian agents. So you see in this naming system a kind of an honoring of people that have represented the colonial processes as well. Kelsey, who was an explorer, Sasquam, and then they've attached in some zones like animals that you find around here. For every year they caught their quota, and I asked my dad about this. I said, how come every year you caught the quota? And he said they caught the quota right away. So I would say implicit in that comment is the understanding that this system was used as a way to regulate the access to traditional foods. And we've seen that happen in other regions, like in the prairies, and the way that foods were rationed and people were intentionally cut off from having access to traditional food. So food security is still a huge issue. We're seeing it more highlighted right now during COVID-19, where people's travels are restricted or limited, and access to our natural foods is really difficult. But it's also showing how resilient and really thoughtful our community members are, because many people have now started informal ways of sharing wild foods, in a more organized way than they have in the past. So on the right is this was carved into the marsh in the 1980s as a tribute to Irving from Irving Oil, who was the CEO of Ducks Unlimited Canada for decades. And it wasn't really well known until a few years ago when it was spotted with a drone. So that has meant that this carving in the land has been there for 20 some, almost 30 years, and it's still like it's still evident the land has not kind of grown over. It just shows like kind of the arrogance, but also like this need to mark the land in a way that's linked to capitalism and you know, other agendas, and as a way of honoring the figureheads of patriarchal systems. So I think this just demonstrates again, like the way that people connect to land and two different kind of ideologies. And these photos here, I think, are important. I took the one on the upper right, and the bottom left, bottom one is, these are both from Finland, and they're showing the trees that have just kind of fallen over in the top right here. And then on the upper left photo by Virginia Johns is a photo of the clear cutting. So this is what is happening to our forests right now around the whole subarctic. And when I asked the people in Finland what had happened there, they said that it's because the permafrost is melting, that the old growth trees are just falling over when they get that first heavy snow. And so the question that I always ask is, like, when you clear cut land, like if you think back to that, this photo, if these are all the elders, how does the next generation of trees learn to be trees? And in these photos, I think, you know, that becomes even more of a pressing question. And you think about like how the next trees that grow up here, who's going to teach them to be trees? If you look at the photo on the bottom here, this is an IKEA plantation, again in Finland, and you can see a different kind of way of relating. So the kinship structure of the trees has been irreversibly changed or altered, where now the trees are kind of like assimilated. And of course, you know, this links to the severing of knowledge systems, but also the continuation of degrading the planet and linking to climate change. And of course, all of this, you know, is paralleled on our bodies of Indigenous people as well. So, however, the good thing is there's always been a continuity of our knowledge and ways that we have recognized and validated Indigenous knowledge. And now there seems to be like a movement, or more of a popular kind of return to a land-based context. So I'm just going to give a few examples, and one is the OCN Mapping Project, where scholars and community members and elders have come together to remap our territory. So going back to the way that we used to name and connect to land here through our language. And so we've been working with the Indigenous Design Studio at U of M to do that, and of course documenting the stories that elders have of different places. And so that project is ongoing. And One House, Many Nations, of course, that's the title of the presentation. So it took a while to kind of lead up to that, but that's the context for the impetus for the One House, Many Nations campaign. So it came out of the Idle No More movement. So it's still connected to Idle No More. And we see it as a form of sustainable housing, but also as a way to educate people about the housing crisis and the needs of First Nations people and other Indigenous people, and then also ultimately as a form of land defense. The first house here was built, I think it was 5 years ago now, in Big River First Nation. And then here in Opaskwayak, we also have been designing and building houses. So part of the process is having community members inform the design of houses that they're going to be living in. As we started these houses, we also realized that, you know, because there's such a pressure of different types of codes, that we had to think of ways to kind of not just mitigate, but like not just go around, but kind of acknowledge and validate those traditional laws or the ethics that are linked to land and connections to land. And so that is how this Muskrat Hut project came about. Muskrat, of course, has a spiritual significance within Cree, not just Cree, but other Indigenous peoples as well. In part, some people's origin story, and also is like one of those creatures that's continually working but doesn't get a lot of fanfare. So the Muskrat Hut was a portable utility hub that has a bathroom, a shower, a heating source, which is a wood stove, a toilet, water storage, and then on the back there's a pop-out kitchen. So the idea was that people could come build these and then use them for cultural events or for land-based education, or of course to support housing. And then that kind of led us to the Making the Shift project, which is a research project with 4 First Nations, Big River, Opaskwayak Cree Nation, Brokenhead, Ojibwe Nation, and then actually the communities in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. And there's youth in each of those communities that are learning to design and then build a house, and then one of them will be living in the house. And then the idea is that they share that knowledge with one another, and then eventually, you know, that they kind of just take that over. This is the first house. It's being built in conjunction and collaboration with students at Nutana Collegiate in Saskatoon. And so this bottom picture on the right here is the house a couple of weeks ago. It now has all the siding on it. And then we're going to be doing the interior. And keep an eye out on the One House Many Nations Facebook page, because one of our research assistants, Kat, is going to be doing a webinar on her own master's research and sharing like the design of interiors and furniture. And so the participants and others, the public as well, can learn the program that Kat's using, but also learn from her knowledge and experience doing that in the projects she's worked on. So moving forward, I guess there's some questions that I'd just like to leave you with to think about, like how can you in your practice, whatever it is, further reinforce a land-based or contextual sustainable focus rather than like a kind of cookie cutter or standardized approaches? And then how can you change your policies, even if that's within your family? You know, there are policies that we create, or governance structures within our kinship systems, our families, our friends, and our work as well. Like, how can we change our policies and practices, and then the practical applications of that to support and reinforce a more contextual, sustainable focus. So thank you. That's the presentation part, and I think that we have maybe have some questions, and I'm open to any questions from either the live stream on Facebook or here in the webinar.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us today, Alex. We really appreciate you joining in with us. And especially right now, I think traditional ecological knowledge is so valuable and needs to be considered, especially again with the recouping from all of the toll that Manitoba and Canada has taken with the COVID pandemic. I think it's really important to start thinking about how we can further incorporate these organizations and these groups in the future. I think this was great, and thank you again for sharing all of this with us. One of the questions that was asked from an attendee here was, How do you think that newcomers can join in with First Nations in terms of land guardianship, policy change, and even trying to attempt decolonization or destructuring the colonized way of thinking in terms of future development? How do you think that would best be approached?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And I think the first thing, and I think my friends and colleagues would probably agree, the first thing is for people to really get a good understanding of the history and
Mm-hmm.
what has happened, because often there's a denial of the severity of the history that's happened, and also little knowledge about how policies today link to former policies that are genocidal. And especially for newcomers, I think the information that people get when they arrive, I've seen some of the pamphlets that they receive, and not only the pamphlets, but also kind of the general narrative, about Canada being this friendly, welcoming place, kind of hides the fact that the reality that racism is so pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
So I would suggest that people really take the time to educate themselves around the history and the current context as well. I know that a lot of people kind of they want to know about Indigenous knowledge, or they want to attend a ceremony or those kinds of things. But before doing that, because that tends to romanticize often our reality, that there's a lot of work that has to be done before people can understand even why a ceremony will take place. So
Yeah, so rather than just people becoming involved with these ceremonies, have a fundamental understanding of what they actually mean, and a better understanding of the importance and everything moving forward. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that the sharing of the deficits in Canadian structure, it's significantly under-recognized, and I think that it has to be further incorporated within the education system a lot earlier than it's discussed, to make positive shifts forward. I think that was a great point.
yeah, and I work in the College of Education, and I've been an educator, for many years, decades, and it's interesting, like, to see now that, like, a lot of my focus is on housing, and thinking about housing as an intervention to so many different things, because I know that, like, it is a major issue for, not just elementary, high school, but adult students as well. Like, always in education, like, that this issue of housing comes up. So it is such a huge issue. And I think if this is one of the issues that we can solve or intervene in, I think that it will have such a domino effect on other interconnecting, challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I think it's definitely misunderstood all the way through across all of the generations. I do think it is a significant issue. There was one of our participants was wanting a little bit more clarification. Um, is it that individuals can't use the forests or use the resources within the forest to build their own communities within their treaty lands? Was that what you were getting at when you were discussing the issue with accessing resources for housing? Is that what you
Yeah.
were?
So
Yes.
there's really strict housing codes. I mean, there's a reason for that. I understand, but at the same time, some of them, like, it's what I'm saying about contextual. So,
Mhm.
like, a person in Toronto creating a code, well, I mean, there's a northern code that's a bit different, but, like, the fact that you can't take a tree, cut it down, and build a house out of it, because the lumber has to be graded. That's one of the main parts of that code. Um, Unless it's over, I forget the size, the beams, but, something like that, that is like something that could really lead to self-sustaining systems, and sovereignty. And then even just the fact that the way that logging operates and who gets the contracts for logging and all of that, and who's grading wood. So yeah, it is, it's fairly absurd.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, I personally had no idea that that was one of the fundamental issues with the housing crisis, was the regulations put in place by the government. And it seems so simple to see that and understand that that's a limitation that's restricting communities, and then try to change it with policy design in the future. And yeah, that alone is, again, not like a component of the issue in totality, but it's just one single component that is a limiting factor for lots of the communities. And yeah, that is absolutely bizarre, that especially in regions where there are so many limitations and so many not enough resources, that is still one thing that has to be addressed. Yeah, that is absurd for sure.
Well, that photo that I had of those trees that were cut down, that pile in itself, which was 0.8 of a kilometer long, that pile was enough to solve the housing crisis in northern Saskatchewan and northern Manitoba, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. How can the One House Many Nations key into the ongoing rapid housing initiative sponsored by the CMHC?
I don't know. Yeah, I see another question about CMHC and the major barriers. So the solutions approach, here's something that's been happening, not just with housing, but with other really critical issues like food security, that the provincial and federal governments have created these innovation challenges where communities now have to write a proposal and propose some kind of innovation to compete for funds or support for basically what should be human rights. So and I'm going to call out the Pallister government right now, because it is so ridiculous, really, that people have to compete to get funds for food, like something that simple, So I don't know who comes up with these ideas. Well, I do know, but the solutions are in our own communities, obviously. Like, we have lived in relation to our lands for not 100, 200, 300, 400, thousands, tens of thousands of years. So people in our communities are the experts on our own experiences. And I don't know how many times we've to say that in so many different ways, but yet they'll come up with another innovation challenge, so that really whoever writes the best proposal gets that funding, right?
Right.
And often, these things are won by corporations or by firms that have unlimited supply to write beautiful proposals, So it's something that's really frustrating. It's something that, that is really kind of draining our energy as well. So I'd like to see CMHC and the Manitoba government and the federal government and First Nations people just support the needs that we identify ourselves, and in whatever way that is. So not having a competition or a challenge, So that's my take on it. And I know that others, feel the same way, and we've been having conversations about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And really too, I couldn't imagine actually the frustrations that you must feel seeing, again, like you're saying, these corporations come in and they have the resources and they understand how to form these proposals in such a way that they become accepted, but they're not acknowledging the explicit faults in the system that the individuals within the communities are seeing, like that. And that's really the core of limitations in policy design moving forward, is there isn't that representation within the communities that can acknowledge not only the explicit faults, but also ways that could be beneficial to move forward. Yeah. again, that comes back to or underrepresentation, I think, is a huge concern in terms of policy design. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so, like up here, that mapping project, like a lot of the lakes are named after Indian agents or explorers or people that have developed the policy. Those policies that have kept kind of a paternalistic approach. And so just renaming already is creating a shift. And I encourage people to do that, even, within their own, wherever they are.
Yeah, absolutely. How would you encourage people who might feel a little bit overwhelmed with the system and all of the different issues that need to be tackled? What would you recommend for them to integrate themselves into change and maybe take steps to be a part of policy change and part of the change without, or not without, but entering into the system and trying to make a difference in first steps? Because it is a really overwhelming thing to see how many issues there are in the system and how many issues there are with policy. But what would you recommend for people who don't really know how to get involved, but are trying to and want to?
Yeah, that's a good one. A good question. And it's a real question, especially right now. Like, a lot of us are feeling the heaviness of COVID and the isolation, loneliness, and then some of these issues are really coming to the forefront. Like just the reality of people not having shelter or not having food. But like I mentioned earlier, there's some really beautiful things that are happening, and that is people are self-organizing. And I think movements like Idle No More, which continues doing work every single day, I think for people to support those kinds of movements, Black Lives Matter, or movements in your own area, not even movements, just actions in your own area. So the term One House, Many Nations, that campaign, like the reason why we called it that was because we really wanted people to think and understand that, that you have the power to make change. And sometimes you think it's a small thing, but start with something small, and then, it can become something bigger, or it could, just remain small. It doesn't always have to become bigger. So that's just my advice, is like, find those beautiful moments where somebody's doing something, and maybe acknowledge it. Like, I'm not saying like on Facebook or whatever, but just maybe acknowledge to them that that you see them, and that the work they're doing is important. Because especially when people are working in isolation, they don't get a lot of reinforcement. And I see people delivering food to elders, and those kinds of things are the kind of they strengthen the fabric of our communities. And so anything that people can do to do that, I think really helps. And people do it in different ways. Some people do it via their computer, or outside. So I can just say that, like, just keep moving forward. And I think that's one of the things that I've learned from working with people in Idle No More, is like, just keep moving forward. And the One House, Many Nations has like brought me so much joy, even though there's frustrations, but like, because people come together from everywhere. And like, we didn't know what we were doing when we started. Like, we said, well, let's just build a house. Like, it's so naive of us to think we could build a house, because none of us knew how to. But at the same time, people came that, well, I can do this, or I can donate that. And people came together, and that's what it's about. So the process is always as important as the outcome.
Yeah.
So when we're building community, to remember that too. So yeah.
I think that was a great answer. Exactly. Like, it is overwhelming, just like you said. Like, you can't tackle these issues right away, but it's the conversations, it's getting awareness, it's making small movements forward. A friend of mine from Brandon University, she is Indigenous, and she attends the Brandon University right now. And she started a fund for a certain group of individuals who are homeless, just to get them resources that they need in this time, especially in winter. Like, it's cold and people don't have resources that they need. And she ended up really starting a huge conversation among Brandon among the Brandon community, and it has resulted in really great outcome and raised awareness significantly. So exactly what you said, I think it's just having those conversations, and even if you have a small idea, it can really blow up to have huge impacts. And that was a great answer. Thank you. What are your thoughts concerning Manitoba's efforts to adopt the watershed-based plans?
The what?
The watershed?
Watershed. I don't know a lot about that, so
Okay.
yeah, I do know though that like right now, working with a few people to investigate how the watershed in especially the Saskatchewan Delta has been impacted by Ducks Unlimited. So that's something I'm learning more about. There's not a lot of info out there, but we're, talking to elders and stuff. So I don't know what the plans are. But I do know that, water is going to be increasingly more of a commodity. We've seen that in the news lately, that it's going to be, that it's people are commodifying it on the stock exchange. And for decades, elders have been saying that like water is going to be something that we need to protect, and of course many people have dedicated their lives to protecting water. So I don't know much more about what that question is, but maybe that person could send me an email if they have information.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. How do you think that we could build and share the best practices around community development? This attendee did acknowledge that it was a little bit of a general question, but they were just kind of looking more towards your experience and your insights regarding building these practices within the community a little bit more.
Yeah, I think just keep at it, really. That persistence, and if something doesn't work, don't get so discouraged. Just try something new. But the reality is, we know that you hold a meeting and it's usually the same people that show up, but that's okay, because sometimes a new person comes, and then and I see a lot of energy obviously in the next generation, that having a conversation like with my grand nephews and niece, who are like between the ages of 9 and 2. they're so aware of everything. And myself at that age, like I didn't have a global understanding of climate change and racism, but yet they are able to articulate and understand how important treading lightly is, or things like that. They use their own language, but so I just have so much faith in the next generations. And so that's another thing too, like intergenerational collaborations to include younger people, but also don't exclude older people too, because the knowledge that they have, even though they may not say it in the same way, their language might be outdated, they still have that experience that can inform. Many of the elders, like they were out there defending the land 50, 60 years ago, or longer even. So they have that well before social media came along.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point. I think that especially now, it's great to see that younger individuals do have a good understanding about what's going on, and they are excited about this. And I do think that social media has helped in raising awareness to these different issues. But I think that a collaboration between traditional knowledge, traditional stories, in collaboration with, the younger members of the community, I think it's super important to have that dialogue continue, and reinforce all of the notions of contemporary issues and concerns. Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm seeing these comments on the side here. I just want to acknowledge that Thank you everyone for your comments here, and I hope we're getting to some of the questions, but thanks for your support too, and I'm really glad that you were able to tune in today.
Yeah. And actually, you know what, that we have only a minute or two left, so I think that's a great note to leave it on. For anyone whose questions didn't get answered, I do know there was still a lot more. Please feel free to get in contact with Alex or the Minipemadazuan partnership, because again, these are conversations that have to continue and really should continue moving forward. Yeah, thank you, Alex, for coming in and joining us today. We really, really appreciate this partnership joining with us. We appreciate your time. And again, these are all dialogues that must continue, and we really appreciate you spending today with us. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
In saying that, have a lovely afternoon, everybody, and enjoy the holidays as best you can. Stay safe. Bye, everybody.